Hello everybody and welcome to today's webinar hosted by the Paddy Ashdown Forum and the Liberal Democrats Overseas. Today we'll be listening to interesting presentations on insights and lessons learned from the US elections. Of course, in the US, the drama continues, but finally we do have the inauguration of President Biden this week. My name is Nasreen Davidson. I'm the Vice Chair of the Lib Dems Overseas and the exec member of the North America Lib Dem branch. I'm based in New York. A quick comment on the North America branch. We cover the US, Canada, and the Caribbean. We are a new branch. We formed in 2020, and we do have an active membership. Our Lib Dem Overseas members are based in total 60 countries outside of Europe, so very well spread. Both our chairs, George Cunningham is our Lib Dem Overseas chair, and Mark Iliff, our North America branch chair, are listening in on today's event. So we do have 4 great speakers for you today. And before I introduce them, I just wanted to turn your attention to the chat where you'll see some of the house rules which are included in the chat. So please do take note of those. At the end of today's presentation, we'll open the forum up to Q&As. As you are listening to the speakers, we do encourage you to put in your questions, your comments, and then we'll have, I'm sure, quite a lively Q&A at the end of this session. Now, I have the honor of introducing our 4 speakers today. We have Robert Woodthorpe-Brown, MBE. Robert is the chair of the Paddy Ashdown Forum. Robert is the vice president of the Bureau of Liberal International and chairman of the International Relations Committee of Liberal Democrats. We have John Surrey. John is a branch executive member of the North America branch. He's based in Philadelphia in the USA. And he has a 30-year experience in advertising and marketing strategy. We also have Rebecca Straley, Director of Client Services at NGP Van. Now, NGV Pan is a software company that's been working closely with the US Democrats and actually launched the largest and grassroots organization program in history. Looking forward to that, Rebecca. And then finally, I'd like to welcome someone who may not need an introduction, but we have Mark Pack, who is the president of the Liberal Democrats. So with that, I'm now going to kick off, and I'd like to hand over to Robert for some words.
Thanks very much, Nasreen. And by the way, I am no longer, after 14 years, I'm no longer the chairman of the Federal International Relations.
Oh, sorry.
Jonathan Pryor's taken that over. I'm still on it, but I try to obey his dictates. Anyway, I wish to add my welcome on behalf of the Paddy Ashdown Forum. Paddy Ashdown was both a campaigner and an internationalist, and so the theme of this seminar would have interested him greatly. The United States and the UK may have different political systems. However, we tried to learn from Obama's first campaign with crowdfunding to compensate for a relative lack of major donors. We also adapted some of the digital platforms used for UK circumstances. And I'm delighted that the party president, Dr. Mark Pack, is participating. He has always been a strong campaigner, not afraid to listen to the views of others. I would like to thank Liberal Democrats Overseas, and in particular their North American branch, also LDO Chair George Cunningham for his hard work and encouragement. Talking of which, my colleague and friend Chris Gleadle has put a lot of work into organising this Zoom event with the backing of ELF, which is the European Liberal Forum, of which the Paddy Ashdown Forum is an active and proud member. So thanks to all and to the moderator for this event. Thank you.
So I'd now like to hand over to John. John, we're looking forward to your presentation on insights from the US election and lessons learned.
Okay, hi, sorry, just unmuting. Let me get my screen up and share. So, thank you very much for the introduction, Nasreen. I'm John Surrey. As Nasreen said, I'm a member of the Liberal Democrats Overseas North American branch. We set out about, I think, 6 months ago to try and get our arms around the story of the ongoing election, or elections, we should say, in the US. And we probably examined 50, 60 sources, analysed a lot of secondary sources, talked to some people, anyone who would talk to us, looked at press, academics, data sources, and lots of interviews with people in the Biden for President team and people also working with the DNC. And our hope, and what we've got today, is some really high-level insights and potential lessons for Lib Dem campaigning from this study. The study will be made available to Liberal Democrat Party members. And our hope is to share what happened at a high level with some food for thought for everyone. Some of it are conversations you're already having. Some of it may well be new conversations. But our hope is, and intent is to share hopefully some practical ideas, because we understand the UK obviously is very different. Some of this is going to be more applicable than other things. But it's about starting a conversation and conversations that might already be started and joining in. So, the non-campaign campaign. In 2020, in the presidential election, basically Trump repeated his 2016 strategy, relying heavily on big rallies and live cable news coverage. But the rallies, of course, were smaller and the coverage was smaller and less newsworthy as well at the same time. Now, the Biden for President team took a different approach. They relied much more on virtual campaigning tactics while signaling that they were taking the pandemic seriously. Now, this isn't about virtual campaigning versus door knocking. That's not the point. Both campaigns did both. And it's important to understand that there were also Senate and House ballots going on too, with individual candidates who followed different approaches. But overall, it is true that the Trump campaign relied far more on in-person approaches. They needed it than the Biden campaign. The Biden campaign drew a contrast and found themselves in a situation where they needed to reinvent and look at the way virtual campaigning could be utilized. Now, many of the online tactics and strategies we're talking about, I'm going to mention, are not new at all. But I think the point to take out is COVID has accelerated their uptake in a way that is going to last. As we see this in every area of life, the way the pandemic has accelerated the digitalization of our lives. And I think that's the key takeaway here. It's not either or, it's going to be both moving forwards. And so candidates and indeed the party and the Biden for President campaign had to completely rethink how they were going to connect with voters. Precinct politics for the 21st century, if you like. Virtual town halls, phone banks, texting and Zoom-style meetings all had to replace traditional campaign events and door-knocking operations. And they got very creative with it, indeed. In terms of approaches that were tried out, there was everything from virtual foreign policy debates, cook-alongs with senators, even virtual dog walks. People had to be creative in how they approach things on Zoom, how they approach fundraising, how they approach meetings, how they approach campaigning in general. In fact, in the actual report, there's a link to over 50 creative ideas that someone posted on Airtable that you can look at, with some great creative ideas for things to do to get people together and be able to do the kinds of things that were done in a non-pandemic environment. So it was really about taking what works in person and taking it online, trying to see what we could do with it. So virtual campaigning, of course, turned out to be more efficient, it greatly extend reach, and be sometimes as impactful as in-person campaigning and traditional in-person events and door-knocking operations. Remember, in the post-pandemic world, we've all got a bit used to this as well now. That's not to say that Republicans didn't go door to door, apparently, quote unquote, sometimes masks hanging from their ears. But the point is that Biden for President accelerated the virtual campaigning. And the other thing that, of course, this enabled was digital organizing, and some of the new technologies we're talking about allowed the Biden campaign to take multiple pathways to victory. Instead of just maybe having 4, 5, 6, 7 battleground states, it allowed the campaign to actually have 17 battleground states, a lot more paths to victory. And that could only have been done using digital technology and virtual campaigning. So to dig a little bit deeper into this, and obviously we don't want this to all be about the digitalization of democracy, as it were, but it is super important. Let's talk a little bit about the Digital Election Toolkit. And top of the list is people in that toolkit, and then passion and technology. I think that's a really good way to talk about it. In this quote, I mean, Rebecca, who's Rebecca here, is going to talk a lot more about some of the digital organizing technologies that we utilized and the incredible numbers that were achieved. So I won't dwell on them in terms of conversations, in terms of contact attempts, and so on. But what I want to do is just touch on some of the core technologies or the things that were in the toolkit. And maybe the first thing to talk about is the demographics here, the digital native volunteers. Huge numbers joined the organization. And in terms of volunteers. And a lot of these digital natives had really got involved in activism, in adjacent issues, things like Black Lives Matter and so on, and found themselves more getting involved in democratic politics. They found themselves. It's also a different situation because it's a two-party run, as it were. So what you found, therefore, is that vast numbers of exactly the right people became volunteers to enable the digital election, if you like, at exactly the time that they were needed. So I think that's an important insight. Data exchanges, it's something very American in that the data played a huge role in this election. It played a huge role in the 2016 election, and the DNC did very badly when it came to data. Hillary Clinton talked to the party immediately after the 2016 election about the terrible data infrastructure that they had. Apparently, databases crashed and went down for up to 76 hours during that election. So the DNC spent a lot of time revamping their infrastructure to be able to take on Trump. And this has to be acknowledged. And so the Democratic Data Exchange, the DDX, came online in June. And by September, it had well over 1 billion voter data points collected on it. And this data exchange, because of the way the law works in the US, allowed all liberal groups to share data between them. Local canvassing groups, state parties, issue-orientated PACs, all of them were sharing data, including data on the likelihood of voters to vote by mail. Things like that were part of the dashboards. So data exchange is very important. Digital organizing technologies. There were 2 key technology companies transformed the DNC's digital campaigning efforts since the 2018 ballots. And in actual fact, they're both represented here because Mobilize and Every Action are now the same organization. And Rebecca that's really why Rebecca is here, because they have that inside understanding. So Mobilize, let's just talk a little bit about that. There's a mobile app and web interface that matches volunteers with local campaigns. The DNC had been using Mobilize since 2018. Because it's digital, of course, it allowed them to reach millennials and lots of groups that traditional organizing methods could not. Proven benefits in the George Floyd protests and March for Our Lives and so on, all proven. Every Action, the other company in technology I mentioned, is really often described as the sales force for campaigns and progressive advocacy groups. So every door knock, phone call, most emails, and millions of online donations running through the Every Action NGP van platforms. So digital organizing technologies, super important in the toolkit. Digital call and text programs, predictive dialing, connecting volunteers with the next available voter who picks up. There was something like 332 million calls in this campaign. Sure, Rebecca's going to give us some more numbers later. But peer-to-peer text programs to enable volunteers to quickly text large lists of voters one by one, and then continue the conversations with those that reply. That was 334 million texts, something like that. And then I think personalization. You know, it's in the digital world and the IT world, people talk about personalization of websites, personalization of communication all the time, especially in my business, in advertising. But there's some great examples of it really happening in this election. Things like the joebiden.com website, where personalized content to new visitors was made relevant to their state on the homepage. There were a vast number of volunteer signups, polling station lookups, and then visits on from joebiden.com to I Will Vote, and indeed, and other important sites. So personalization is key. Experimentation. There was a lot of experimentation in this election. Things like Facebook click-to-messenger ads, which hadn't really been used before, where you're starting a conversation with targets who are unreachable by phone, but were then, of course, picked up by chatbots. Those technologies were used extensively and tested extensively in these elections. There was something like 247,000 unique chatbot conversations took place. So all interesting new technologies in the toolkit. And kind of last but not least, automating the tasks that volunteers find difficult, or automating the tasks that are the core tasks that actually take up time and stop volunteers doing what they need to do to campaign best. Automation became a big aspect of the technological toolkit. And then next level micro-targeting. I'm going to talk a little just for a moment about Facebook and Facebook advertising and targeting, because again, you know, there was a lot of talk after the 26th elections of the Trump organization deploying Facebook ads to powerful effect. But in this election, Democrats too spent heavily on Facebook, mimicking door-to-door canvassing, targeting zip codes, targeting small groups and even individuals. If we look at, this is data from the Ad Observatory, who are part of the University of Pennsylvania, and they've collected volunteer information on Facebook targeting. You actually have to apply to Facebook to get the information. And so these are just examples that have been supplied. They have a very comprehensive database of it all. But if we look, what you've got going on here is the targeting method in the left column, and then in the center you've got the actual audience. What was being targeted by Facebook in those communications? So, for obviously, location. Home is in North Carolina. That's an example of traditional targeting. Visited a particular website or online behavior, or interested in the National Rifle Association. This is some Trump targeting. And then if we look at that crazy long list from Ultimate Fighting Championship through to Ted Cruz and so on, of different interests that people had. These were all targets, examples of targeting of Facebook communications from the Trump campaign. But also both parties used what's called the custom audience feature, where campaigns are uploading spreadsheets of users' profiles to be able to deploy their messages with pretty surgical precision. So there's an example of a list of specific people uploaded by a consultancy there. But also the lookalike tool, which became very important in this election, where you upload a list of people and then Facebook finds other people who are likely to respond because of their algorithm in similar ways to those. So next generation micro-targeting was an important aspect of the toolkit, if you like. So a lot of the upshot of this was making local battles national and national resources local. What do we mean by that? Well, there's two kind of aspects to it. The first was massive mobilization. It was enabled. The Biden campaign digital organizing team used a distributed organizing model, not uncommon, to build massive volunteer capacity virtually. volunteers were empowered to organize from anywhere across the country, online or offline, to build relationships with and mobilize voters on behalf of the campaign. And there are two tracks: national distributed and battleground distributed. National distributed, in that track, as it were, volunteers from non-battleground states were able to join the campaign, get trained to the same level as volunteers in battleground states, and have a major impact in the battleground states or wherever they were needed most. So they were deployed, if you like. And then there was the battleground distributed organizing, where state-based programs focused on recruiting and mobilizing volunteers to organize and mobilize voters within their own communities and constituencies. But the upshot of all of this was recruited, trained, and mobilized volunteers across the country, regardless of their location, ensuring that they owned a piece of the campaign. Directed their capacity into target states, empowering volunteers across the country to take part, whilst maintaining the impact of strong state and local organizing programs at the same time. The other piece is really, I guess, the more inclusive and creative fundraising that was enabled by a lot more activity going online. So there's two aspects to this, two things to point out. Individual candidates in this Congress and Senate ballots were able, of course, to reach out nationally to raise small dollar donations from anyone in the country via Facebook, via Instagram, and so on. But also at the same time, virtual fundraising events made participation easier for everyone. They were more inclusive. People were able to join events, especially some of the more creative ones, that were in different states and in different locations. So you had that two aspects to the making local battles national and making national resources local that was accelerated and exaggerated, if you like, by the need to do things online and virtually. Indeed, when it came to fundraising, Biden actually became the greatest magnet for online money in American political history in terms of all the small dollar donations ever. So, and that's all really down to these changes in behavior, you could say. In terms of the get out the vote, I mean, this was the biggest get out the vote drive in history. In many ways, the most important aspect of the entire of the elections. And what this needed was voting guidance at scale. If you think about the massive effort involved in getting out the vote that took place in this election, there were digital get out the vote campaigns from both parties, chasing voters, targeting them every step of the way with information and reminders, tracking them, making sure that they had everything they needed to make a plan. Massively expanded for both parties. And often, and again, this was a fairly new thing in digital investment for getting out the vote. It's not the traditional way of doing things. It's very much more of an in-person door knocking campaigning drive normally in election situations. But so both parties and both campaigns invested heavily in this. And the effort began early in September and didn't really stop until, election day itself on November the 4th. And campaigns used everything: Facebook, Snapchat, YouTube, text messages, emails, and other platforms to do this digital chasing and target voters all the way along the line. And I want to pull out two key aspects of this. One was the Biden campaign's makeaplan.com interactive experience that walked you through your voting options. I mean, this was a very successful way of providing guidance at scale. Customized, totally individualized to the person, finding their local polling center, or whether it was by mail, giving them the deadlines, giving them everything they needed for their local area. They had something like 600,000 unique page views on makeaplan.com, and I think nearly 112,000 voters completed a plan to vote. Also, the Vote Joe app, which guided volunteers to text family and friends in their contacts and help them make a plan too. That enabled the campaign's relational team to guide volunteers and help them make a plan based on their state and get involved with the campaign. There was something like 200,000 relational conversations through the Vote Joe app. So voting guidance at scale is a key thing to think about, because as we'll see, a large part of really the success of the Biden for President campaign in this election was all about getting out the vote and tweaking the turnout knobs, if you like, on the subgroups who did so well under Trump. So let's talk a bit about the basics for a moment in terms of messaging. So for someone who actually had a reputation for going off script, sometimes even rambling, Biden did it beautifully in many ways. He won the persuasion game by being totally consistent with his message and successfully articulating his rationale for running in the first place over and over and over again. He had very simple messages on unity, character, and competence, combined with this pledge to control the pandemic, as we all know, and be a president for all Americans, of course. These messages resonated really strongly with all the subgroups, the key DNC voter, target voter subgroups. So it's a simple messaging, consistently delivered. It's also true that the Biden campaign drew this stark contrast with the Trump campaign and actively looked at every step to try and contrast. You know, whilst Trump was anti-mask wearing, whilst Trump was, and of course eventually got the virus himself, Biden sought to draw contrast, urging social distancing, wearing masks in public, and so on. So contrast, consistency, character, and contrast. I wanted to mention market research. So message testing research in this election moved up a notch in its sophistication. Metrics around persuasion advertising remain very primitive or misleading in general. But from 2018, a lot of Democrat organizations and PACs have been creative testing strategies and messaging using more sophisticated online research methodologies to prove which messages actually work. And there was a number of things that were discovered. They discovered that a lot of the advertising, in fact, the majority of the advertising, over half of it, from the 2016 election, had actually been turning off the core vote, the core Democrat base, in its messages and in its communication, which is a horrendous thing to find out after the event when you've spent so much money. But in this round, what they realized was that ads attacking Trump's character alone were a total turnoff. Negative advertising, even in this election, ads attacking Trump's character alone, were turning off not only persuadable voters, but also Democrat base voters and low propensity voters who were already contemptuous of politics anyway. So that's a key learning. And despite vast sums being spent on the strategy of targeting never Trump Republicans, it turns out there aren't any. In fact, you know, as we know, there's more Republicans voted for Trump in this election than the last one. So a vast amount was spent by super PACs on advertising, trying to appeal to Republicans by pointing out Trump's character flaws and so on. And it turns out that the never Trump Republicans were not a statistically significant group anywhere really in the United States.
So John, as your moderator, I'm giving you like a 2-minute to go.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to move towards the wrap. There was a lot less Biden had a lot less negative ads than the Trump campaign, and what I want to do is just highlight that the new kinds of message testing research showed that homemade, straight to camera, Joe Public testimonials performed best. optimistic stuff, showing diverse faces and highlighting the historical struggles actually out-tested a lot of stuff about policy and certainly stuff about negative advertising about Trump's character. And this one here, again, if you get the report, there's links to this. There was one particular spot that was a web spot called Voting versus Protest, or Vote, Protest and Vote. This is a classic example of what really tested well and worked well in terms of online communication. It had the whole mix. It had diversity, it was optimistic, it frames the whole voting issue in the context of historical struggles, and of course was narrated by Obama. So it's a great example. I would check it out of probably a piece of communication that worked tremendously well in this election cycle. So we come to the end. Biden's campaign strategy was ultimately all about adjusting the turnout knobs and getting out the groups who powered Mr. Trump to victory, and that is what they successfully managed to do. To paraphrase Paul Maslin, who is a Democratic pollster from Wisconsin, you know, this election, what the Biden campaign did, it was just enough to swing an election in a deeply divided nation, and the galaxies, as we know, are still spinning away from each other. So that's it from me.
Well, John,
thank you all very much.
Thank you, John. Excellent.
Thank you.
So now I'm going to hand over to Rebecca. Rebecca, the floor's yours.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm just going to get my presentation up very quickly and then start sharing my screen, although apologies, this is not taking over the screen I wanted it to, so let me just move over. I will be looking to the side, so apologies for that. And just a quick introduction. My name is Rebecca Straley. I head up the client services team here at NGP Van. We're also known as Every Action. That is us. It is just a different name. We use our NGP Van branding with our political clients, and then Every Action tends to be with our nonprofits. So in case you are curious on why we have two, it's just to try and help differentiate. And really what our tools and what our goal has been, you know, prior to the pandemic, has been trying to get our clients, whether it's the DNC, individual campaigns or nonprofits, to get, you know, the full 360 view of a supporter or a voter to best be able to engage them with your organization. That engagement differs depending on who you are, what you're trying to do, and where you are in a campaign in particular. But, you know, we're always trying to kind of get that full scope of what that person's going to do and engage. So looking back on 2020, John promised I would give you some more big numbers. This is across all of our clients during the 2020 election cycle. We saw numbers we had never seen before. You know, our 2018 cycle, the midterms here in the US, you know, where there was a lot of push of an anti-Trump kind of agenda from the Democrats, we saw higher numbers than we did in 2016. We expected 2020 to be even higher, but, you know, these, as you can see, greatly exceeded. In terms of total successful contact attempts, we had over 600 million attempts to contact voters. You can see here we had 2.2 million virtual phone banks that made over 755 million phone calls this cycle. So, you know, and I think, again, the kind of real, those are great big numbers and in the abstract, but I think to add, you know, context, knowing 2016 to 2018 saw an increase, we still saw 2 times the number of phone calls made compared to 2018, 2 times the number of users made action IDs, which are used for our open virtual phone bank tool, as well as Minivan, which I will talk about a little bit. And again, total successful attempts. To even give more context, we saw a 400% increase from the 2016 election cycle with Hillary Clinton. So that's, you know, definitely to say we had a larger volunteer base ready to make more phone calls that were more engaged and with our tools. The other number that I don't want to kind of get lost is the 12.5 billion emails sent. If you've ever ended up on a campaign email here from the US, you'll know they love to send a lot of emails. So that 12.5 billion number did not surprise me or my inbox. But again, you know, we saw this multi-channeled approach to get in contact with voters. I'm sorry, I thought I had muted that. I really apologize for that. And again, we talked a little bit about the number of donations processed. We saw 150% increase of donations compared to the 2018 cycle, where we saw, you can see this like $8 billion number over 98 million individual contributions. If you start to do that math, again, we're still seeing lots of those small dollar contributions. And again, this is not just Joe Biden. This includes people like Jamie Harris, who broke the record for number of donations raised in a Senate campaign ever. So this was a really big year. Why is this? There we go. And so what we saw, and I don't think this is really surprising given kind of where the world was a year ago today. Over the presidential primary, we were ready for a minivan election year. If you've ever used Minivan, it's our mobile canvassing app for door knocking. And we were ready to see, this kind of really sharp increase of people going door knocking paperless, which has always been our goal, is to try and get people off of paper lists and trying to get everything digital to make it easier for everyone in the campaign office, from the volunteers to the folks who normally would have had to do that data entry. And after the March 3rd Super Tuesday primary, which was really, while the primary was not officially over after March 3rd, that was kind of the beginning of the end of the primary. After Joe Biden had won so many states, we saw the unsurprising drop off of, minivan kind of not being used. We did see some continued use. What we can't tell from our vantage point, because we did try to make the app better for lit drop, which I'm putting in here as a plug for those of you who are using Connect, which is one of our products. I've done a lot of delivering in my day with you all, specifically in Portsmouth. Shout out, that's my my designated British campaigning home. But we did make it so it was easier to quickly mark that you've dropped literature at the door, in order to make sure that if people still wanted to do some of that in-person, safe campaigning, that was still able to do so. The real lesson of this cycle, though, was Zoom and phones for our tools. They were not the only ones, but there's lots of other digital organizing that was super impactful, as well as events that I will get to. But the resurgence of phones, can't be understated. I know I keep giving big stats. I will not read all of these out loud, but the thing that we saw with the increase in digital organizing was the importance on phones, again, to have that multi-pronged approach of getting in touch with either a volunteer or a voter, to have that personal connection with the campaign. It is one thing for someone to say, I support Joe Biden. It is another thing to say, I support Joe Biden enough to make calls, but just because they've said that online doesn't necessarily mean they're going to show up. And the thing that we continued to see was you needed to do that touch back. You need to have that human being call that person, and have a conversation with them to give them that ownership of the campaign, to make sure that they know that they're a part of the greater movement. That was true for Joe Biden. That was true for Senate campaigns and House races across the country as well. And the other thing, as John mentioned, like, events moved to Zoom at record numbers. We saw quite a bit of Zoom use. I can say, like, anecdotally, I attended a few low dollar fundraisers because I was excited about guests and just sat in my living room and watched over Zoom. But, organizers also used it to do one-on-ones. We saw a lot of phone bank training, where, again, after those personal calls you may have had with an organizer in an office, you then were on Zoom together with all of the volunteers, able to ask questions before you got on the phone bank. This was particularly important because with this election, being able to tap your national volunteer base. I live in, Somerville, Massachusetts. which is a very, very progressive area. All of my elected officials already represent my beliefs, but I wanted to turn the Senate over so that I could actually see those policy changes happen. So I made calls into other states because that was what made sense to me. But having this phone banking training over Zoom really helped make sure that I was given, as well as any other volunteer, the context of the area. It's not great to drop in someone, like regional differences are very real here, as I know they are in Britain. It's not going to be great to drop someone in who may have a bunch of talking points that make sense for their area, but not the area they're calling into. And so again, it's making taking advantage of the national push that was there and making sure it was contextualized for local calls, for that local engagement. So just to highlight some of the tools, and again, I tried cutting this down and it became very large. So I'm going to try not to go too quickly. You will get this afterwards, but I do want to highlight a lot of the tools used to make sure, you all get some eyes on it. Number one was virtual phone banks. We did work on a version of our tool called Open VPB. To kind of get to that predictive dialing that John had mentioned. So here in the US, predictive dialing is pretty heavily regulated where you can only call landlines, you can't call mobile phones. And so because of that, there's always kind of the attempt in the market to get something that is a little more automated in calling, that still is within our regulations, that also allows you to call mobile phones as people more and more shift to having a mobile phone rather than a landline in their home. And so we use our open virtual phone bank tool to have more of a click to dial. That ended up, really taking off. This was used by the OSSEF campaign in Georgia. This was used pretty heavily in South Carolina. The Biden campaign used it across multiple states. Arizona was definitely one of their biggest use states for this tool, so that people at home could easily log in, start making calls without having to worry too much about manually dialing numbers over and over. The other thing that's really great about our virtual phone bank tool was this distributed canvassing that was able to be done, so that we could also try to, pair you with voters, especially for volunteers on border states. Where I live in New York, not too far from Pennsylvania. New York was not a battleground state for Joe Biden. Pennsylvania absolutely was. So making those calls into New York based on, you could have it so it was based on the proximity the volunteer was to that community they were calling into. So again, getting those more, as much as you can get to that local messaging, those local conversations, you can help kind of bridge the gap, even though they're not, in fact, Pennsylvania voters. The other thing that was, again, it was the year of the phones. When I'm gonna think back on this cycle, the year of the phones is definitely one of the things that will stand out. In addition to calling, was absolutely text messages. And so this is highlighting one of our tools that was really our bulk SMS tool, which allows you to send via text, for people who have opted in, messages that are customized. I always think of these as a great reminder of an event you've signed up for, where you've already had that one-on-one contact with someone, but it's the day of. You don't want to have your organizer still call through all of the people who have signed up, so you can send out one blast message. The other thing John talked about that I want to really highlight as well was the use of peer-to-peer for voter contact. We have integrations with partner companies. Through their tools, you can then customize your messages that you are then having your volunteers, they call it text banking. It's really great, especially knowing some volunteers don't want to get on the phone. And so they're still able to engage via the phone from their homes without having to go into an office, which obviously is not an option right now, and be able to give those personalized messages to voters and have those conversations just over text rather than on the phone.
Great. All right, Rebecca, thank you. Have you any last words before we move on to?
The one thing I would add, because I want to get to just events quickly and at least kind of touch on Mobilize, since I know it was brought up, but we did build out an integration with Zoom. And I think this is where the piece of digital organizing I see kind of being used. I'm hopeful heavily in the future, because I think especially for organizers who know I just had an event of 100 people, I need to get all those signups. I need to get all their information so that I can engage with them further. The Zoom integration kind of pulls in everything the person was required to fill out to even get into the Zoom, so that you have a way to get back in touch with that person. Because it's really great to start to engage, get them into your organization. But then if you don't have that means to follow up, they just came to an event, and now you know that they're willing to go to an event. You should get them to come make calls. You should get them to find a way to engage with you even more. Um, that was definitely heavily used with the Zoom integration. We're excited because we did, right after the election, acquire Mobilize, which was extremely heavily used as the online sign-up forms, where you could, from one form, sign up for, phone banking across the whole country as well. Whether it was in, I decided to do Arizona for one part of the afternoon, and then I could call into Michigan later in the day. That's kind of where we're seeing the future of these events and digital organizing, is trying to, keep that engagement from across the country, and get them into the system.
Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you. That was extremely fascinating. So now we are coming to our fourth speaker, and we have Mark. Mark, I'm going to kick off and hand it over to you. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you. I've just been desperately scribbling through those two really excellent, really insightful presentations to try and work out what the lessons are that sort of we in the Liberal Democrats should take away from that. And I guess one is, most importantly, to thank everyone involved in doing the research for this report and putting this call together, because I think this has shown the real value of our overseas branches and overseas local parties. This is the sort of thing that clearly is massively better because by being informed by people who have been sort of on the ground and in contact with the relevant people. So thank you for that. And hopefully that's a reminder to us all about the real value of internationalism in that sense. I guess the second lesson I would draw in a way, it's a general one that's sort of been implicit in what everyone has been saying, but is also, I think, quite relevant to British politics, which is we should have a little bit of optimism. I mean, thank goodness. I mean, just imagine what this call would be like if Trump had won, so, and I know it was a close run thing in some ways, and I know that it's easier with some distance across the ocean to look at what happened with a sense of distance from the horrific events with the storming of Congress. But it does look like not only democracy, but liberalism has come through and won. It's one way of looking at the politics of the last 4 years in the US is that 4 years ago, the Republicans had the presidency, had the Senate, had the House. Now they have lost all three of them. And so I think that should be a modest cause for optimism that liberalism can still prosper in the 21st century in the face of all of the challenges that there are. But then thinking more specifically about some of the more sort of organizational and tactical things, one thing that struck me, particularly with what, John, you were saying, was the number of things the Democrats did differently this time from last time. And in a way, to be able to do that as an organization, you have to be a bit of an entrepreneurial culture, in that both being willing to try new things, but also not being too scared if they don't work. Because if you're worried that if you try something different or new and it doesn't work, that you'll be shouted at or sacked or whatever, then that puts you off trying in the first place. And the reason I particularly draw that out is that I think in the Lib Dems, we can end up being very risk averse for fear of internal criticism. And actually our own internal inquiry into what went wrong in the 2019 general election picks up on that, about how often, for example, staff felt they were under fire. And obviously, given all the things that went wrong, criticism sometimes is definitely justified and definitely necessary to work out what to do right. But I think there's an interesting lesson there about how we at least do criticism in a way that is productive, as opposed to scaring people into sort of small c organizational conservatism. Because a lot of what John talked about, and indeed actually I guess a lot of what you talked about as well, Rebecca, wouldn't have happened if the Democrats had been in that, you know, we've just got to do what we did last time sort of mindset. The other sort of, I think, the thing that spanned what both John and Rebecca said was the importance of sort of sustained long-term development of infrastructure. Whether, and I think particularly both the presentations are sort of focused quite a lot on the technology side of that. Of course, what has happened in, say, Georgia with Stacey Abrams and her colleagues very much illustrates the grassroots element of that. So, but in different ways, in terms of grassroots organizing, technology, data, digital, and so on, there's a value in sustained long-term development. And for us here in Britain, that's particularly a challenge, I think, because a lot of members and donors get most excited and motivated by general elections. And so I think one lesson is, and a challenge for us, is how do we keep people interested and motivated at the other elections in between, and indeed in the fallow periods, to be able to sustain that long-term development of infrastructure that, as we've seen, brings so much benefits. And then I thought there were 4 other sort of more specific organizational things. One was that, although, I mean, John, you used obviously the US jargon of talking about battleground states. In Britain, we would think of that as target seats, target state, is that clearly targeting works. It can be done badly. And, you know, even when you do it well, it's rarely done perfectly. But fundamentally, the Electoral College is the first past the post electoral system, with, I know, exceptions for Maine with the preferential voting there, and a couple of places where they're, you know, split allocations by congressional district. But fundamentally, the Electoral College is a first past the post electoral system. And in that, targeting worked really well for Biden's campaign. And so there's a lesson for us that what we got wrong with targeting in 2019 was the execution, not the principle, I think. And the Biden campaign is a reminder that the principle is the right one. And the second sort of organizational thing, I think, that again came out really clearly was this point about political messaging and how what your activists like, or what your gut feel might be as to what will work, is not necessarily what makes for effective messages. And I think if part of that, it sounded like, is that, you know, this question about, do you try to mobilize your own supporters, or do you pitch to the swing voter? So part of it was about Biden's campaign was deliberately aimed at people who had voted for Trump, as it were, rather than people who had, say, voted for Bernie Sanders in the primaries. It was designed to win over the swing voter rather than to really mobilize the base. But also, the thing that particularly caught my eyes and ears in what you were saying, John, was that it was more than that. It was also that what people thought might work for the swing voter often turned out in testing not to be true. And there's a big lesson for us in the Lib Dems that we really under-tested some of our messages in 2019. Now, both of those things that I've mentioned, I think, are in a way things that colleagues in the Lib Dems will need to hold people like me and Mike, our chief exec, and so on, to account for, because they're sort of central challenges in many ways. But there's also an element of the infrastructure development, which is very much something, in a sense, for all of us, and in a way is, you know, the grassroots contribution is crucial to that. In particular, there's one point which I've sort of had picked up in my pre-reading, which I thought was quite interesting about how Biden's digital campaign worked, which is that a lot of the social media campaign was most effective through its outreach by taking messages to people who then used their own social media channels, which then in turn reached voters, as opposed to trying to and hoping to have lots of real voters come to the official channels of the Biden campaign. And there's a lesson there, I think, for us, particularly with, you know, slightly different structure of politics in the UK, but where we have, for example, so many councillors in communities around the country, they're sort of the equivalent of the sort of Rhiannon style influencer in the US, as it were. You know, that both of them are the route to reach the audience and the voters. And I think, you know, definitely we need to up our game in lots of ways in terms of what we do centrally on digital. But to me, part of the lesson is that maybe we need to think about, it's not that we want the central, say, Lib Dem Twitter account to be massively effective at reaching voters, because maybe that's the wrong objective. The right objective is, how do we get another 2,000 really effective Twitter accounts from councillors that are brilliant at reaching voters? So that might be the lesson. And then the final point was which I have lost in my notes. Oh yeah, it was about the need to sort of campaign well before polling day. Because the thing, and apologies, Rebecca, the thing I always find when I'm listening to figures from the US is I automatically divide them by 12. And the reason I do that is, firstly, the US is roughly 6 times the size of the UK. So, any number about number of phone calls, just divide by 6 to get. The other is, frankly, for the Lib Dems, an amazing election result would be 25% of the vote. Democrats or Republicans, for them, they want to get 50%. So in a sense, take any US number, divide it by 12, that gives you sort of the pro rata, what would be the equivalent of the Lib Dems. And the thing that struck me about the number of canvassing conversations, that was that sort of, that comes down to, as it were, about 1.5 million in a UK context for the Lib Dems, which is not that much more really than we've managed in the past, actually. But we've managed in the past in elections where we've then done really badly. And so the lesson I take from that is that we can't just bank on everything coming right in the last few weeks or months. So if in that sense we have in the past run Biden scale voter outreach campaigns and yet got completely tanked, the answer is not to simply say, oh, we need to do even more in the last 4 weeks. It's about, again, that long-term activity. And I think that's to my mind, that's the real challenge I take away from all of this, is how do we get members as enthused to be out campaigning post-coronavirus, of course, because there are many restrictions, especially, but also there's some stuff we can do under current restrictions. But how do we get people as motivated to be out campaigning through this year as they would be if it was a general election year? Because that, I think, is the real secret to our long-term success. Anyway, those are some initial thoughts, but the main thing I wanted to say is just thank you so much. That's really fascinating set of presentations, a really useful report, and I'm sure there's a lot we can learn from that. And as we digest it, who knows, that initial set of thoughts may alter and change, but I'm sure it will be, there will be many decisions we will make better through this year as a result of what we've heard. So thank you for that.
Indeed. Well, thank you, Mark. That was a very helpful summary of what you've kind of heard there. So we actually have some great questions, actually, but I'm just going to just open it up before we kind of open up further. I have a question actually for Robert, particularly. The start to kick off there. There you are, Robert, putting you on the spot. So the question is really about, with great that Biden won, but but what we have and what we've seen across the world, and particularly in the US, has been this erosion in the election process, and therefore less trust in our democratic processes as well. How do you feel that as a party that we can help restore, if we can, that faith in our election processes? Oh, you're on mute. You're on mute.
First thing, of course, is that we both have got fairly rotten and unrepresentative electoral systems. Parts of the UK have got proportional representation, but Mark referred to first past the post, and first past the post means that most of the country doesn't take part in the election really, because their candidate will be a shoo-in, and the Lib Dems have got the problem always of fighting, with a few exceptions, from a position of weakness, that we have to convince a lot of people who demographically tend towards one of the two major parties. So therefore, people say, why should I bother? Because I'm not going to make a difference. That is the first problem of trust in politics in the UK. Second problem is that we seem to have been going through a period, which I hope the demise of Trump is not physical demise yet, but the demise of Trump may begin to see the end of this personality politics, where you have got some showman who, and we have our own mini showman back home, who basically think that they can get a big audience because they can be popular and they can say anything they like and contradict themselves 3 minutes later. And the COVID problem, or the COVID pandemic, has really shown this up. Because if you look at U-turns, the number of U-turns that have happened, statements have been made which have had to be unmade, often within hours. This is a total contrast to Taiwan. Taiwan was a place who decided to take the public into their confidence right from the word go. They demonstrated they were telling the truth, and the people therefore followed what they said without any of these laws which we've had to have. Yet in our country, nobody trusts, everybody knows that we have got a braggart, a liar, a philanderer as a prime minister, and he's not deserving of any respect at all. Therefore, whatever he says, people dismiss it. We have a cabinet which is made up of people whose only qualification is that they're Brexiteers. Well, some of us, of course, as Lib Dems, we all think if you're a Brexiteer, you may not be that bright. But the point was, we have got people like Hancock in charge of the health ministry, and he is somebody who engenders no respect at all. The only chance these guys have got is when they bring on a couple of medics, Professor Whitty and others, and one listens to them and ignores the politicians. So therefore, the trust in politics has gone backwards. I'm just hoping that if once one gets rid of Trump, we may get rid of some of the other horror stories in the world, starting with ours, but people like Erdogan, Orban, and people like that. And we liberals have got to actually get trust in politics by showing that people who are liberals, who believe in doing things properly for the people, and not just kleptocracy that we've now got in our country, the chumocracy, kleptocracy. I believe that the trust has got to be earned. We liberals can do it, but because I think that the Tories and the Republicans have actually blown it completely.
Thank you.
Mute.
Here, agree with that. Thank you. So we have a question from Alexandra, and I think, Rebecca, this might be for yourself, that obviously with this advent of COVID, digital campaigning obviously was something that, that really had to kind of be ramped up. So if we are at a point where we go back to normal, vaccinations are done, will we see the end of some of those digital tactics, or has life changed from a digital campaigning perspective?
I think from what we've seen and conversations we've started to have with folks, post-election, I don't think we're going to totally go back to normal in terms of campaigning. Do I think we expect to have field offices again? Yes. But I think now that people have seen this is easy, I can do these things from home. I can do, Zoom trainings for my volunteers from home. I think we're still going to see that element of digital organizing continue. I do think we're going to return, eventually. I'm excited to go back to door knocking. That is my favorite. So I do think we are going to have a return to some of the more traditional ways to organize, but I think we're always going to have that overlaid with these more, digital tools. We were already on that trend prior to the pandemic. The pandemic just kind of forced the necessity for that's all we could do. And I think once, 2022, I'm hopeful for that election here, at least, that we're able to kind of marry the two together and really see the impact we can have while still getting to, enjoy a field office and have bad pizza.
Yes. Now, one point you made actually was just around the mailing list that you have now, that you captured the registration list. So with a view that 4 years is not that very long away in either country for an election, what happens with that mailing list now? Has it become dormant, or what do you do?
The emailing list. Typically candidates will keep, even if they haven't won, they continue to email to that list. We have some regulations where you are not allowed to share that list, just because of how emails are handled here. So it's not uncommon for honestly, Mayor Buttigieg, after the primary, was a good example of this. He pretty immediately after his presidential campaign ended, formed a PAC to start fundraising for races he wanted to contribute to, and he just turned that email list into his PAC emailing list and continued to send them emails trying to get supporters to keep engaging. So I do think we will continue to see, again, for some people they love it, for others they don't, but the onslaught of emails from these candidates and organizations.
Okay. So this question could be for all of you, but I'm actually going to ask Mark, rather, not Mac, Mark. So Mark, what do you think we need to do now? What do we need to change now in light of some of these lessons learned from your perspective?
Yeah, so I think one is that sort of entrepreneurial culture. I think that's crucial. I think there is a specific thing picking up on actually what you were just been saying, Rebecca, around text messaging. There are some very challenging compliance issues with that in the UK. But I think given that some organisations in the UK do manage to use text messaging, that's on my sort of to-do list of things to see if we can look at again in some way. But I think crucially, the sort of, if as it were, if I can balance those two central party elements with a third and final bit of the answer about all of us need to sort of get into doing more sustained in digital and infrastructure building in the long term. And that's as much about how do we make sure that the central party doesn't end up in the traditional sort of boom and bust cycle focused around Westminster general elections, but also something that, is for all of us, in whether it's in local parties, branches, regional parties, state parties, and so on.
So I have a question from Sarah Brittany, France, and the question is actually about the overseas constituents, members, and how do we produce policies or help engage Lib Dems overseas in terms of starting to pull in more votes, helping the federal party? So I think that question, I'm going to go back to you, Mark.
I think in some ways, actually, the most important element of that are our federal party conferences. So our two big national conferences that we have each year. For the first time, we did one online in the autumn. This spring conference is going to be online. And I think, it's not for me to unilaterally decide, but I think it's pretty likely people are going to want to have some sort of continued online, presence at conferences, because it's opened it up to far more people. So we had our highest ever attendance at an autumn conference for the year after a general election last year, even though frankly the wider environment might mean you might have expected it to be one of our poorer, and so that really demonstrated just how effective online is at expanding the reach of people. But crucially, what that means is, and I think it'll be good to hear from colleagues in Lib Dem in Lib Dems, not just in North America but elsewhere around the world. There's an opportunity now. We've essentially got two big events a year which members overseas will be able to take part in a way that only very, very few, because of travel time and costs, have been able to in the past. And that's a real opportunity we need to work out how we can crack.
Yes, I concur with that. Being able to have joined, it's great. So, John, I have a question here for you in terms of your research. And this is actually from Alex Brewer. And Alex asked, did the message change for digital as opposed to in-person? And if so, was that something that you picked up on in your research?
No, I think it was pretty consistent. And in the Biden for President campaign, the messaging for that campaign, it was very consistent and really reflecting his own his starting point, with his reasons for standing, the character, the unity, that story. It was very much directed straight from Joe Biden in the beginning, and I think you saw that in every which way. It got I guess a little more complex when you get into the get out the vote messaging and things like that, protest and vote and some of the targeting more specific subgroups. But I think overall it was consistent and the same offline and online.
Now I have another question actually for you, John, and this is from Sarah again. And do you think if we'd had the digital messaging in 2016, that there would have been a different president? based on your...
I mean, from everything we've learned, I feel like there are distinct issues with Hillary Clinton in terms of her appeal to certain subgroups. I think there are issues there. And by the way, I think that's obviously it's a bunch of different things. It's no one thing. But I also think, so I think there's that issue. I think the terrible technology situation of 2016, clearly from everything we've read and analysed, was a massive issue for the Democrats back then. That they didn't have a level playing field with the Trump campaign. It wasn't level, and I think that's something we need to try and find a way, to create one, even if it's with all the challenges of cost and budget and so on. I think that's probably at least having a level playing field when it comes to technology and when it comes to infrastructure. There's got to be a focus, as Mark was just saying, and the sustainability of that, I think, is absolutely critical. So I think it's more about that than particularly than the messages. I think I would highlight the things that are different: technology, the level technology playing field, if not superiority. Vast numbers of extra volunteers coming in, and I think and simple messaging. I do think simple, clear messaging. I mean, having 3 simple, clear messages that you consistently deliver is critical. And so maybe in that sense, that's another big change this time.
Could I just maybe add something on the messaging point? Because I think there's apologies for anyone who's heard me make this point before, but I think there's a point on messaging that the 2020 US presidential contest and the 2016 one actually really powerfully illustrates, which is, I think, almost every Lib Dem who's in the UK, or indeed in other countries, not the US, would if you say, would you have preferred Biden to Trump? Really strong view, yes, definitely Biden. If you then ask, and obviously Lib Dem members in the US will be a little bit different in this respect, but if you ask Lib Dem members anywhere else, okay, tell me 3 Biden policies in a degree of detail. And actually, we then all really struggle. Well, we know he's quite good on climate change, so maybe Paris Climate Change Accord, something. And he's probably quite good on health, but does he want an NHS or not? Does he want a bunny something? Maybe not. And he's quite good on immigration. I guess he probably wants to not go. And very quickly you get from being absolutely sure that Biden is better than Trump to not really knowing actually very much about Biden's policies. And I think there's a lesson there. It's a reminder that's always easier to see at one step removed, that a lot of political choice comes down to factors other than policy. And so policy is important, but we should remember that the solution to a messaging and popularity challenge is normally in part policy, but very much involves things other than policy as well. Hence the fact we all want Biden, but can't write down many of his policies when pushed to it.
Yes.
I think it's, if I might just, one other thing which I didn't really get time to talk about was the issue of COVID versus the economy. A lot of commentators have said really that's what the elections were about, and the numbers back that. Of the people who thought that we should be putting the pandemic ahead of economic interests, Biden won it, the vast majority of them. Of the people who thought the economy is more important than COVID, Trump won the vast majority of them. So if you look at the numbers and see it in that polarized way, I think that is a valid way of talking about the election. However, I think we feel it was a missed opportunity. We allowed, by not messaging on the economy, we allowed the Trump campaign and the Republicans to call everyone socialists, and allowed them to rebrand Democrats as socialists, and allow them to tell a story about the economy versus COVID, if you like. And yet the Democrats had a great story to tell about economic transformation, and the green transformation of the economy, if you like, which wasn't told properly. So sometimes, even when you simplify messaging, you can also miss out things. And I think that's something to bear in mind. We never forget the economy.
Well said. So, Robert, I have a question for you, and and whether or not you have perspective. Obviously, there was a lot of Russian, potential Chinese interference, and maybe other players during all the elections. And from your perspective, do you feel that something has reduced that allowed Biden's message to get through, or has there been a drop in maybe the attacks that we've had over this kind of period of time? I just wondered if you had any thoughts or perspectives on that from an international perspective.
Well, the point is that the Russians subcontract a lot of what they do, as do the Chinese. They have got their own interests. They certainly were involved in the election. I don't think sufficiently that their message got sufficiently through to save Trump. I'm not totally convinced that they really wanted to. I mean, what they loved, what they have really enjoyed about this is the complete kerfuffle that happened after Trump lost and him fighting it away, because they could therefore diss democracy generally by saying, well, if this is democracy, who needs it? We're much better off. But the bots that these guys have got, these huge operations, and as I say, they use the Bulgarians, they use the Iranians, they use all sorts of Syrians even to attack. And this is something we have got to be terribly worried about in the UK. These guys can hack. They can hack into anything. Elections are one thing. The question is, when you start now, we start going to 5G, sorry, what are they going to be able to hack? What social services are they going to be bringing down? And I think the cyber warfare, this is going away from elections, I suppose, but cyber warfare is the most worrying thing going on at present.
Oops, good point. Yeah, thank you. John, just a question. I mean, it was interesting just listening about, your insights, 7 insights. And I just wondered, when you kind of think about those 7 insights, is there a particular insight that you feel has more priority over the 7, within the 7?
Yeah, I have to say, getting to a technology infrastructure, data infrastructure, I have to say that's the biggest takeout from this whole election cycle. Finding a way to get the right technology to support the people. If we've got great people, you've got to enable them and empower them so they can be the best they can be. And I'd have to say it's kind of getting the right stuff in the digital toolkit moving forwards is going to be critical.
And I have a question for Mark. Mark, I'm putting you on the spot a little bit here, just in terms of, we've talked obviously about the US election, and we talked about how much funding that came into the US election. When we think about the lessons learned and what we could take for the UK perspective and for our party, we don't have that funding, so how could we maybe think about some of those lessons learned, but do it maybe on a more budgeted perspective?
Yeah, I mean, there's an interesting question about the importance of money in politics, which maybe is actually a cause for optimism, although wrapped in some pessimistic clothes in a way, which is that the Democrats have massively overcome what used to be a huge funding deficit they had relative to the Republicans. And although the Democrats, they now control both houses of Congress and the presidency. So although the Democrats in some ways have had a good run of election results, particularly when you dive into the down ballot results, it's not at all clear that reversal in financial strength has really benefited the Democrats that much overall. And likewise, if the Lib Dems in 2019, we had our best funded general election campaign by some margin ever, we didn't quite have the result that we might have hoped for that. So there is a weird way in which you sort of think we shouldn't, at least in the past, we have sometimes thought that our problem is we don't have as much money as the other parties. And I think the lesson to draw from both of those things that, you know, the money has, I'm sure, helped the Democrats, but it didn't sweep them to all the sorts of victories in down ballot races you might expect if you look just at the weight of money. And given our own experience here in 2019, is we shouldn't use that as an excuse. Sorry, I feel I've answered a slightly different question from the one you've answered, but hopefully so to come back to your point about the lower, the key thing is grassroots activity, because if you are, say, a councillor or a would-be councillor or a ward organiser, the best way of getting email addresses is through asking people in person on the doorstep. In the UK, a bit different, I guess, from the US, that is overwhelmingly a volunteer activity. So that's a sort of not completely cost-free. There's a bit, but it's basically a cost-free activity. And a lot of what you can then do with that data is, again, not completely cost-free, but is very low cost. You know, it does cost a bit of extra money to send more emails and so on. So it's the local data gathering, but gathering not just traditional data, but also the data we can use for digital campaigning, I think is the heart of the low budget implementation plan.
Yes, and I think to reiterate, George Paynes has just made a comment, just saying it's the message that's more important than the money. I think that's what you're saying there. And a question therefore, Rebecca, I had a question just around, with all the volumes of emails that were sent, how many were actually being read? And that came from actually Tom Stubbs.
That is not a stat I have, but I can answer, you know, our best practice for emails, because there is a lot, we could do a whole session on just email deliverability and ways to make sure your messages are even viewable and not going to spam, and that you're really following best practices. But the kind of one line I will give is only target people who are engaging. So, you know, you get that new email into your universe, you go, great, I'm going to send them an email. You then email them for 3 months. And if they don't ever read, maybe send a like, are you not getting these? You know, try to re-engage them. But the point being to not continually send emails to people who aren't engaging. Because then it becomes clear that that is not, you know, one of the multi-pronged approaches to get in contact with that person. So I know it doesn't answer the like how many were read. I don't have that stat. I am curious now. I'm gonna go see if someone can easily pull that for me across our clients. But it's just making sure, you know, when you're emailing smartly, the same way you would with calls, the same way you would with door knocking. You wouldn't go to someone's door 3 days in a row if you talk to them once, or, you know, making sure you're using your resources efficiently and effectively is how I would also view email.
Yes. Okay, thank you. And we have a question here from actually David Chadwick, who's asking about, tell us about the voter app, Joe app, the Vote Joe app. I think that was something that maybe John, did you mention that, or was that Rebecca? It was John.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually why, like, I don't know whether Rebecca has more knowledge about it than I do off the top of my head. It's essentially a rebranded app that already exists, and it's you know, it's all for doing relational conversations. What we could do is by follow up is definitely send the person who asked specifically about that some more information.
I think I can do the
follow up.
2-second pitch, because this was not something we developed, but we worked with the Biden team on making sure everything else kind of worked with it, because it was something they kind of managed within the campaign itself. But yeah, it's a relational organizing app where you would download it and basically grant it access to your contacts, so that it would then kind of tell you, especially during GOTV, which of your contacts matching back to the voter file have or haven't voted. So that you could say, my best friend, I know is a Democrat. She said she was going to early vote. She hasn't voted yet. Let me go get in contact with her. So that it was kind of another way to have an arm of the campaign without feeling like the campaign was getting in touch with that person. So yeah, it was an interesting use of, I mean, I think Hillary had an app as well, but I didn't quite do that. I think you managed an office in that one. But so it's always trying to like get, you know, people to engage with their contacts. And I think it seemed very effective this year from anecdotal evidence that I have heard.
Thank you. So I'm just going to have a last question here because I'm just conscious of time. And Mark, I'm going to direct this to you. This is from James Croft, who's in St. Louis in the USA. And he asked about my question about the content of our messaging. What can we learn from the US election about what we should be saying to voters as opposed to the mechanisms by which we should be reaching them?
Don't disrespect people who disagree with you. I think, it's almost perhaps Joe Biden's philosophy on life, and it's actually what makes him, a massively admirable person, is his ability to empathize with and connect with people whose political views he nonetheless significantly disagrees with. And I think that made him, in a way, the choice the Democrats had in their primary and caucuses in their selection contest was, do you go for Bernie Sanders, who would be brilliant at mobilizing the base, or do you go for Joe Biden, who would be brilliant at reaching the swing voter? And that's, different elections, different choice can make sense about mobilization versus swing. But Biden, and, there's a imagine how Biden, if he was a British politician who had voted Remain, imagine how he would talk about Leave voters. It's not the sort of rhetoric that even, colleagues in the party quite often use about Leave voters, or, Biden didn't use anything like the basket of deplorables language that Clinton had used 4 years before. And so I think there's, and this is maybe more about tone rather than sort of policy specific message, as it were, but there's a tonal thing about respecting people you disagree with as the starting point to persuading them.
So I think that was an excellent last question. So thank you, James. And so we've come to the end. So I want to thank all of our speakers. I think we'll find that it was extremely fascinating, absolutely hearing from all of you, from the number of questions that we've had. And I'm sorry we haven't been able to get to all of them. So maybe we should take a look at those and see if there's kind of some follow-ups we can certainly do. Just as my recap, just in kind of listening to everyone here, and obviously kind of living in the US for such a long period of time, and the last few years, and especially since we've seen kind of President Trump elected, we've seen such a proliferation of so many bad actors, as we know, and limited oversight. We've seen it in the US, we see it in the UK, we see it everywhere. The pervasiveness of this kind of false narratives, with they're being consumed through kind of multiple platforms, and taken at face value. The question is like, and we've tried to kind of talk about this, how do we continue to cut through that noise and the smoke screen and really deliver on a compelling message, and that reaches a broader and more importantly, as we've seen in the US election, and you've kind of talked to this, is that a more diverse groups that have kind of felt left out in kind of prior campaigns. So I feel that I've heard this from the speakers today, and it's something for us to kind of really kind of take away. Because obviously of COVID-19, we have obviously technology has accelerated. We see the investment in technology platforms. Rebecca we've heard from her in terms of the success of the work that you've done, which is brilliant. And thank you for helping to get Joe Biden to win. And the challenge is obviously to kind of making sure that we retain this, but also, how do we retain the ethos of who we are as a party and what do we represent in all of this? And, and Mark, you kind of mentioned that in the last kind of point that you made. And I think it's important that we kind of all take that into consideration as we kind of look out at our political in volunteerism. But also, from a John perspective, your 7 insights were particularly interesting, and thank you for that. Rebecca, you brought this to life for us, and I think the outreach to the grassroots campaign is very significant with digital campaigning, and we've talked about that. And Mark, thank you very much for bringing relevancy to the UK perspective, and Robert, with your kind of internationalism and your kind of perspective on a broader external world helps it all bring together. So I think we can say that this has given us all food for thought. I feel like there's more that could be kind of dug deep in everything that has been said. And thank you to all our 4 speakers, and certainly to all of you that have been listening, and for all of these wonderful questions. We will be disseminating to the Lib Dem members, and I know that you will be asking that on the chat. And today's event will be recorded, and certainly you can play this at your leisure again, as I'm sure you will want to, in the coming few days. So thank you again to everyone, and I wish you a good everything, whichever place you are in the world, as many of our guest speakers and individuals are here from all over the world itself. So happy to have spent time with you, and I'd like to say goodbye. Thank you all.